Uh, let me welcome everybody to today's gathering on the occasion of Hari's 71st birthday. Um, um, I find it very hard, like most of you, to think about Hari in the past tense, to say Hari would have been 71 today. The years and months after 10th May 2020 have become a bit of a blur, and it's hard to believe that this is the third birthday that we are commemorating without him. But as on the last 2 years, we decided that his birthday or the time around it would be the time every year when we would try and do something for him in remembering him, an aspect of his many faceted interests. So we had, just to briefly recap the previous 2 years' events, in February 2021, we had one of Hari's closest friends, an eminent Russian historian, Professor Dominic Levin, who's fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge, who presented out of his, what was then still his forthcoming book called The Emperor in World History. That session was actually chaired by Bhaskar Chakraborty, and it was hosted by the Calcutta University History Department. Last year's event had Professor Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak engaging us. She was closely associated with a particular project where she drew Hari in. Her theme was Radiating Globality, working with Hari Vasudevan. And the session was chaired by a close friend and colleague of both of ours, both Hari's and mine, Professor Lakshmi Subramanian. She joined us from Goa, where she's a visiting professor. We are delighted to have with us today one of Hari's former students and an eminent scholar in the field of Russian and Soviet history, Professor Choi Chatterjee, who's now known as Choi Chatterjee. She will be speaking out of her, presenting a part of her new book, but I leave it to our chair today to introduce Choi in greater detail. But before I move on to introducing Shukriyadi, who actually in many ways needs no introduction to anybody, to large numbers of people, certainly to nobody in the city and outside, but I think to large numbers of people here. I'd like to say a special thank you to my brother, Raja, and Choi, because they are joining us California time, 6 a.m. in the morning. So really, thank you very, very much for accommodating a time that is convenient to us in other parts of the world and, taking on this thing so early in the morning. I'm especially honored to have Professor Shukriya Chaudhary be the chair for this session. I thought of Shukriyadi partly because Choi's work moves between history and literature and environmental studies, as we will see. But I also thought of Shukriyadi because she's truly been a friend and colleague to both Hari and me for several decades now. I'll give a brief formal introduction to her and then just say a few more personal words about why and how Shukriya Chaudhary is the iconic scholar, teacher, and intellectual that she is. She is currently Professor Emerita in the Department of English, Jadavpur University, from where she retired some years ago, and has been head of the department, coordinator, Center for Advanced Study, and director, School of Languages and Linguistics. Shukriyadi was educated in South Point School, at Presidency College, Calcutta, and at the University of Oxford, graduating with first-class honors in English in 1975 and getting a DPhil in Renaissance English literature in 1981. Chupriadi has held visiting appointments in several prestigious institutions in Oxford, in Cambridge, University of Paris, Sorbonne, at Erfurt University, Germany, and also lectured in several places. Her areas of scholarly interest are truly wide-ranging, from Renaissance and literary studies to philosophy and critical theory to Indian social and cultural history, urban studies, sports, travel, translation, and modernism. What is also remarkable, I will not read out her several books, edited volumes, and authored volumes, but I will say that what is truly unusual about Chupriya Chaudhary is the way she carries so many versatile talents within her, from being an excellent teacher, scholar, writer, translator, book reviewer. She's also an expert in karate, and she is a great sports person. And it's not often that we see this combination in a person like this. I will also say that when Chupriadi joined as a young teacher in Presidency College, she was only a few years older than us, 4 or 5 years older than us. And she was really an inspiration. From being accessible, she became friends largely in the course of a college excursion we all went on, where because the history department had no women teachers, we used to borrow our women's teachers from English and other departments. And one year we had Chupriadi. We had the pleasure of having Chupriadi with us. And at the end of it, she had become more friend than really teacher. Chupriadi continued to be an inspiration over the years that followed. She moved after several years of teaching at Presidency College to Jadavpur University, where along with her husband Shukanta Chaudhary, they built one of the finest English and more broadly literary and cultural studies department, certainly in India, but I would say across the world. Chupriadi has remained an inspiration in the way she combines her different roles in teaching, writing, and the way her interests range from Petrarch to sports, from writing about Chatterjee Ray's films to writing about Chondi Mongol and how far the city of Calcutta is reflected in it. So this is an amazing range of scholarly interest that makes her truly exceptional. She was also a friend and a neighbor in Salt Lake. Our children grew up together. Their home, our home were places she, with Shukantada, would visit. And she became in many ways a kindred spirit, a fellow traveler in the broadest sense of the term for both Hari and me. So I'm truly delighted that Chupriadi agreed very readily to chair this session. And I will now hand it over to her. And then we will move to Choi's presentation.
Thank you very much, Tapati. This is, overwhelming. You really shouldn't have said all of that about me. I am very moved and touched by this introduction, which I don't deserve at all. As I look at the first screen, I look at Hari's face and I remember Hari. It is his birthday today. We all remember him so warmly. We remember the twinkle in his eye. We recall his voice. It's not just the face, but his voice that I remember, because we go back so far back, Hari and I boarding the bus together from Salt Lake, traveling to the south, and his clear carrying voice across the expanse of the bus commenting on some aspect of urban life. So there are so many reasons why today we recall Hari, and we are extremely grateful to all of you who are present here to remember him, and particularly to Professor Choi Chatterjee, who was taught by Hari, I think, who was one of his favorite students and somebody whose work he greatly valued and followed over the years. We are very, very grateful that Professor Chatterjee is here to give this talk in Hari's memory, to give this lecture. I think that I would like to begin by saying a little bit about Professor Chatterjee, and then we can move directly into the lecture. At the end of the lecture, we will take questions. So you can either write your questions in the chat box or raise a hand in order to place them. Professor Choi Chatterjee is professor and chair of history at California State University in Los Angeles. She is the author of Celebrating Women, Gender, Festival Culture, and Bolshevik Ideology, 1910 to 1939, which appeared in 2002, and co-author of the 20th Century, a retrospective, also appearing in 2002. Later, she published Russia's Long 20th Century, Voices, Memories, and Contested Perspectives, 2016. She is co-editor of Americans Experience Russia, Encountering the Enigma, 1917 to the Present, 2013, Everyday Life in Russia, Past and Present, 2015, and 2 volumes of the Global Impacts of Russia's Great Wars and Revolutions, 2019. Her most recent monograph is Russia in World History, a Transnational Approach, which was published in 2022 by Bloomsbury Press. And what she will be saying today is drawn, at least in some measure, from that book. Since I at least have not read it, I am looking forward very much to the way in which Choi will be analyzing the understanding that we find in both Tolstoy and Tagore of the natural world, and how it shaped the development of their lives, their literature, and their politics. It's important to remember today that a century ago, Tagore and Tolstoy argued that we need to align ourselves to the natural world and work in cooperation with the environment, not simply in order to protect it or to conserve it. I think that Professor Chatterjee in her own life has been a passionate advocate of everyday environmentalism. She is the co-founder of a project on the historical database of climate-adapted agriculture in Los Angeles, and has been, working with the project in her own backyard as well as in her own university. So we are, all of us, I think, looking forward very much to Professor Chatterjee's exposition of Tagore and Tolstoy. And I feel that Hari somewhere is also listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Supriyadi, for this very kind and completely unjustified introduction. And thank you, Tapudi, for inviting me. If I had a choice, I'd be having coffee with Hari at Fleury's and not presenting on this occasion. I am not his former student. I am a student. I will be. And I went to school, to Presidency College in the 80s. It was a remarkable time. And Rajat Babu, Ajay Babu were my professors, and Rajat Babu arranged for these brilliant young scholars, Tapudi, Rudrangshuda, Bhashwarda, Shekhwarda, to come and lecture to us. And I just remember as a young undergraduate student, so dazzled by their erudition. And then I went on to my master's, and Hari joined a little late. He had just finished his PhD at Cambridge. I remember waiting for him and being really apprehensive. In those days, somebody coming from Cambridge was terrifying. And I just remember thinking, I'm going to study Russian history with Dr. Vasudevan. How's this all going to pan out? I remember sitting on the steps of Hajra, and then Hari came with that kindly twinkle in his eye, so unassuming, so down to earth, put me at ease right away. And then I realized what graduate education was. It was about Hari not lecturing me or not reading out from his yellowed notes, but Hari talking to me, with me, and Hari insisting that I read deeply, broadly, sharing his books. And I remembered one time I wanted to do a project on Lenin's views on agriculture, and Hari's response was, 44 volumes of Lenin, what's stopping you? And that was his way of teaching, making the student feel empowered about approaching these primary sources, which we scholars hold so dear in order to shore up our own expertise. And there was Hari saying, read it, if you don't understand, we'll discuss it, but take a shot at it. I just remember that it was so formative in my life, and I've tried to be a little bit like Hari in my own teaching, to make students feel that they too can be scholars, that they too can join the community. He was not a gatekeeper. He held the door wide open so everybody could enter academia. And so I will always be a student, not his former student. I also want to thank Raja Guha Thakurta for arranging this session and recording it. Thank you very much. And so when Tapudi invited me, I thought, okay, this has been a busy year. I will give a talk from one of the chapters. And then I opened the chapter a few months ago and I said, my thinking has evolved so much. I'm a little bit ashamed I wrote it in 2016. And so the book compares the British Empire with the Russian Empire and argues against the notion that the British were liberal and the Russians were liberal and bad. And so the first chapter is really inspired by my sister, and I will get into that, and her love of Tagore. And so just I remarked upon the various ways that Tolstoy and Tagore's ideas, and not just on nature, but on politics and imperialism, was strangely congruent. And I couldn't find any scholarship on the subject comparing the two, although there is so much scholarship on each of them. And I just want to tell you that I am neither a scholar of Tagore nor a scholar of Tolstoy. And so why am I here and why am I speaking about them? And I'll tell you a little secret. I am speaking about them as a practitioner of bread labor. So I don't come here just as a commentator. There are many people far more qualified than I am, but I am reading their work through my own experiences of bread labor. And I think that adds something, because sometimes when we turn brilliant personalities into just that, we forget that their creativity came from their engagement with life. And there has to be a way to bring that back into academia. So I'm going to read a little bit from the talk, and then I will get into explaining some of my ideas as why the best approach to nature might be something they advocated, which was through sensory perception, cultural imagination, bread labor, and spirituality. We now have very strange words to describe the environment: climate apocalypse, climate crisis, climate emergency. These are words that are meant to dehumanize, denature nature. When we hear these terrible words, we think they're so big, we need a transnational corporation or the government or an NGO to solve these problems. Who are we ordinary mortals to try and address climate emergency? And I would reverse that and say it has to start with us reestablishing our relationship with nature. So despite my best intentions, one way or another, bearded prophets have ruled my life. Tagore was one such formidable presence, and the ascetic image of the handsome man clad in dark robes cast a very long shadow over my youth and childhood. The main thoroughfare of the city of Kolkata was named after Tagore. His home in Jorashako was a site of pilgrimage, as was Shantiniketan. And during the winter months, the broken pavements of Kolkata rang with his music, poetry, dance, dramas, plays, as cultural venues, big and small, competed to perform his works. His songs blared from loudspeakers. His photographs in street corners, stores, homes were adorned with fresh garlands of flowers. Every child could recite his poetry, every woman could sing his songs, while every man knew his novels intimately. And what annoyed me the most was the way in which people closed their eyes reverentially whenever his name was pronounced, as if invoking a deity. I grew up in a household whose adoration of Tagore bordered on the fanatical. My grandparents could recite chapter and verse, and my sister and mother conducted entire conversations in Tagorean song and verse at both lunch and dinner. I was the lone holdout, countering their admiration for this progenitor of modern Bengali culture with juvenile and ignorant sarcasm. I fled the close confines of this dense literary culture for the wider steppes of Russia, hoping to find broader vistas. Unfortunately, and to my deep regret, I found that Russians had produced both Tolstoy, and the cult slightly before that of Tagore. In Russia, too, people tended to close their eyes reverentially whenever the name of the great man was invoked. And they asked me over and over again, had I been to Yasnaya Polyana, that was Tolstoy's home, and had I read Tolstoy's great novels in Russian. I dutifully plowed through Anna Karenina and War and Peace without hearing the music and the words, or deciphering the meanings and the characters as they struggled with history and daily life. And now, of course, in my old age, I'm 58, I come back to Tagore and Tolstoy. Why? Because I think the 20th century has been about the right and the left, about fascism and socialism, about liberalism. These are ideologies that have completely crowded out other counter-modern ideas. And in a way, people like Tagore and Tolstoy, who did not belong to the establishment, their ideas have been deeply censored. So in India, we tend to think primarily of Tagore as a literary progenitor. His political ideas are always seen as somehow less important. In Russia, the censorship of Tolstoy started in 1917. Lenin was very aware that Tolstoy's ideas were very, very powerful ideas. And by 1918, they had stopped dissemination of all his political ideas. By 1929, Tolstoyan communities were in the Gulag, and they realized it was very hard to break these people. So in 2003, the Russian Orthodox Church refused to reverse their decision to excommunicate Tolstoy. So this man has power beyond his grave. And so I thinking in the 21st century, if you had to create an archive of political thinking, of alternative political thinking, then maybe Tolstoy and Tagore are good people to start with. Tolstoy died, let me show you some pictures, I'm sorry. And so my daughter put together this PowerPoint for me, and she put some photographs side by side. I like this one very much. Okay, I'll leave this one on. So Tolstoy died in 1910 at the height of his global prominence. Tagore was drawn into the international limelight in 1913 when he won the Nobel Prize unaccountably. That had eluded Tolstoy, who at that point was far better known than Tagore. Even though their lives overlapped, Tolstoy died before Tagore's poetry was translated into English, which he read. Tagore, for his part, was completely unimpressed by Tolstoy, and he writes, tried to read Anna Karenina, could not go on, found it so unpleasant. I cannot understand what pleasures can be had out of such a sickly book. I cannot stand for long these complicated, bizarre, perverse goings on. So he's very uncharitable about Tolstoy, and it's quite apparent that he is unaware of Tolstoy's political ideas, which to me was surprising because Gandhi had, of course, read Tolstoy in London, changed his worldview completely. In fact, I really now think Gandhi read much of the Gita through the prism of Tolstoy's version of Christianity. And so it is interesting that Tagore was unaware of the work that he was trying to do. Despite their predilection for black robes and unkempt beards, these were not Eastern prophets. They were neither anti-modern champions. They were cosmopolitan intellectuals who profited handsomely from the global literary marketplace that they helped create. And they both profited from European imperialism and from the land markets. The Tolstoy family had served the mighty Russian state as noblemen for many generations, while Tagore's grandfather had more recently amassed a fortune in participating in the British-run opium trade in Asia. Both took for granted ancestral estates, the comfort of educated families, retinues of servitors, an assured position in Moscow, the seat of the old Russian nobility, not St. Petersburg, and Calcutta, the capital of British India, even though they despised urban life. Fame came very easily, both of them. With their very first publications, they found appreciative and eager audiences. They were also very powerful men, right? We forget the power, the political power that they wielded from outside the political parties. Such was their global fame that nobody could put them in jail. In 1906, Tolstoy writes to the Tsar. He says, take a noose, put some soap around it and hang me in the public square because I cannot bear the repression that I see in Russia. The Tsar, all he does is he suppresses the letter because such is the power of Tolstoy. Even the Russian government cannot put him in jail. And Tagore was one of the few people who actually escaped being jailed in British India. But despite the many accolades and the material rewards, they were tormented, perverse, vocally anti-establishment figures, searching in vain for that inner peace and contentment that eluded them their entire lives. They were lonely men. They did not find companions among the multitudes that thronged them. But their inner demons, I would argue, made them experiment with new ways of thinking. And sometimes you need that suffering. You need that intellectual suffering to produce great works of intellectual complexity. They died unquiet deaths. Neither of them had an easy death. They were deeply apprehensive about the future. Their rebellious personality and their propensity to flout social and intellectual norms came from their aristocratic background and from their lack of formal schooling and lack of formal religious instruction. Tolstoy failed in college. He was thrown out of the University of Kazan. Tagore, who was sent to London to study law, came back an accomplished poet. They were very dismayed by the institutional training, regurgitation, memorization that seems so prevalent in modern educational systems. Tolstoy experimented with popular education his whole life at Yasnaya Polyana, and his corpus of children's literature, which is so magnificent, and I hope someday will be retranslated. Tagore, of course, as we know, in addition to writing children's literature, he first set up his school, then Shantiniketan, then Vishwabharati, and very importantly, Sriniketan, right? The institution that was for rural reconstruction, which still exists. Tolstoy, in his arrogant way, completely rejected the authority of the Orthodox Church, the Russian monastic establishment. He taught himself ancient Greek, and he rewrote the Gospels. Tagore came from a family of iconoclasts, right? His father, Rabindranath Tagore, had created what in fact was a new religion. He mercilessly criticized Hindu fundamentalism in Gora and then Visarjun. They also hated the literary establishment. This that have made me laugh so much. Composed of universities, scholars, professional writers, journalists, and they believed the academic separation of art and life, knowledge and wisdom, intellectual convictions and daily life, religion and spirituality was profoundly immoral. Tagore and Tolstoy argued that this distinction between poesis, the art of imagination, and praxis, the ability for the practical execution of ideas, was the single greatest threat to human civilization and nature. They were finally cantankerous and cussed men, right? Opinionated, vainglorious, absurdly sensitive, even when they said the most outrageous things. So, Tolstoy, after having dashed off one of his horrible letters, is then feeling really sad. And somehow no one told him that maybe if you stop writing those letters, you'd have less reason for grief. They abhorred the unfreedom that membership in any organization or social milieu, and they refused to join political parties. And though they were deeply wounded by the many attacks that were leveled on them in print and in person, they pursued their lonely quest till the end of their long-lived life. So sometimes it doesn't matter if people don't like what you're saying, or it doesn't matter if the public isn't approving. It is important that you stay true to what you think is right. Coincidentally, Tagore and Tolstoy were married to conventional women, much younger than them, while Mrinalini had the good sense to die early and relieve Tagore of her humdrum presence. Sonia, depending on which side you take in this marriage, was there till the bitter end. We don't know, did she really save the Tolstoy family from his craziness? Or did she drive Tolstoy to his death because of her insistence that he also take care of the family? We will never know. But people are still taking sides in that marriage 100 years later. So now I will talk about their ideas of nature, some of their ideas of nature, because how can I do justice to their ideas? Now, they were not anti-science, right? So it's important to remember that they came of age when science had not dominated the world entirely. So 19th century, there was still some parity between the village and the city, and they were very interested in science. If you look at what they were reading, Tolstoy especially was deeply interested in science, and so was Tagore. He sent his son to University of Illinois to learn about animal husbandry. He was interested in breeding the best kind of cows to increase the milk production in India. So these are things that he really cared about if you read his writings. Now, but they were landlords, right? So that's important to remember. So their approach to nature was very complex. On the one hand, aesthetic and sensual, which is the part that we have celebrated, but also utilitarian with an understanding of the ethics, the lack of ethics, the morality and the immorality that govern land ownership. And in their writings is filtered through their personal experiences. And finally, there is a spirituality that they are not ashamed, right? So that notion of awe and transcendence, which appears in their works repeatedly, comes from a very intimate knowledge of nature. So for Tagore, nature was not a category of analysis. It really annoys me a little bit when I see nature as a category of analysis. It was not a category of analysis. It was where he lived his life. He slept in an open veranda to catch the first rays of the rising sun. He gloried in the rain, and even the fierce heat of the midday sun didn't send him indoors. Tolstoy thought nothing of walking from Moscow to Yasnaya Polyana. Into his 70s, 150 miles. He had a fight with his wife. He got up and he walked home. He also walked several times from Yasnaya Polyana to Kiev, the monastery of the caves, 1,000 miles several times, working with ordinary peasants, living in their homes. It was the aristocratic homes that made him very, very uncomfortable. They hated the city, Moscow or Kolkata. They condemned urban spaces as parasitic and unequal. Tolstoy believed that man's estrangement from nature was the root cause of the epidemic of violence. Tagore feared that urban spaces stunted independent thought and diminished our capacity to experience moments of transcendence and discovery. Now, the village was very key to their understanding of human civilization, not the city. Now the village is also an ecotone. An ecotone is a biological concept when two kinds of life meet, right? So when the village, when the open fields meets the forest, that is called the ecotone. That is where the village is located. It is like when the river enters the ocean, it's the delta. The delta is one of the most productive areas of the globe. Now, neither Tagore nor Tolstoy romanticized the peasant or village life. As landlords, they knew the peasant capacity for irrationality, laziness, and violence. But the village functioned as a metaphor in their writings, and they anticipated what is now known as deep ecology. The fundamental premise of deep ecology is that human beings are but a tiny part of these vast biotic systems. So rather than conserve nature, which seems to be the predominant and the only way we can think about it, they said we should align ourselves with the natural world, first through observation and sensory immersion, cultural imagination, bread labor, and spirituality. And in the time remaining, I will go through these ideas. How am I doing on time, Tapudi?
I told you you have lots of time, Choi.
Okay. Okay.
There's lots of time, really. Please just go ahead, and I'm sure there'll still be time for questions. So easily another 15 minutes, easily.
Okay. I will definitely mention 15 minutes. So I'm going to read out this magnificent paragraph from Tolstoy's The Second Chapter of Youth. And it's, I wish I could read it to you in Russian because everything is better in Russian, but this is the best translation I could find.
Would you also read out a bit in Russian, Choi? It would be lovely to hear the Russian, and then there are some people in this audience who may be knowing Russian, so it may be nice. Yeah.
Tapudi, I don't have the Russian thing here,
Okay,
so I only have the English.
That is fine.
Okay. So have you ever during the summer lain down to sleep during the day in cloudy, rainy weather, and awakening at sunset, opened your eyes, and in the widening quadrangle of the window from under the linden shade, which billowing beat like a switch against the window pane, seen the shady violet-colored side of the avenue of linden trees, wet from rain, and the damp garden path illuminated by bright slanting rays, heard the sudden merry life of birds in the garden, and seen insects translucent in the sun, which hover in the window opening, felt the scent of air after a rain, and thought, how could I not be ashamed to sleep through such an evening? And hurriedly jumped to go into the garden and rejoice at life. If this has happened, then it is an image of that strong feeling which I have experienced then. Two key words that I'm going to take from this. One is the linden tree, and the other is, are you not ashamed? And hold on to those two ideas. So the linden tree is not just special to Russia, it is special to all of Europe. It is in Tilia cordata is one of those incredible trees. In the summer, the flowers are so thick that they drip nectar. The bees cluster around the linden tree, they're unbelievably fragrant. And it is a cultural trope that every noble estate in Russia had an avenue of linden trees. So when scholars write about it, it's always about nostalgia, right? This was a vanished aristocratic past. How do we recover that? We have to go to Yasnaya Polyana. We need an avenue of linden trees. But there is another reading of linden trees. This was the tree that the Russian peasant used, the bark. They used it to make their shoes. They took the honey, this greenish honey, to cure many of their maladies. the twigs of the linden trees, the bark was used to carve icons. Andrei Rublev's famous icons of the Russian Orthodox Church were carved on this linden tree. So there are ways to understand nature where academics privilege one kind of aristocratic reading, but there are peasant understandings of the linden tree, there are cultural understandings, and there are religious understandings. And finally, what Tolstoy is saying, are you not ashamed to miss this nature, right? So that is the key word. It's a strange word to use at the end of such a lyrical passage. And I'm going to read. I want you to think about what happens when we plant that linden tree, right? If we plant that tree in a busy urban space, what miracle of nature happens? We suddenly have a little habitat for birds and bees and insects. Somebody might sit under the shade of the linden tree. Somebody might collect the flowers, dry them, and make a tea out of them. You might carve your sacred image on the bark of the tree. So if we do away with nostalgia and read these texts as things that we can adopt in our current life, I think it changes a little bit. I'm now going to read you a passage from Tagore, from his Creative Unity. One day in the small village of Bengal, an ascetic woman from the neighborhood came to see me. Her name was Shorbokhepi, the meaning of which is the woman who was mad about all things. She fixed her star-like eyes upon me and startled me with the question, when are you coming to meet me underneath the trees? Evidently, she pitied me, who lived, prisoned behind walls, banished away from the great meeting place of the all, where she had her dwelling. Just at that moment, my gardener came with his basket. And when the woman understood that the flowers in the vase on my table was going to be thrown away to make place for fresh ones, she looked pained and she said to me, you are always engaged in reading and writing, you do not see. Then she took the discarded flowers in her palms, kissed them, touched them with her forehead, and reverently murmured to herself, beloved of my heart. And he ends it over there. But here is a woman who is not ashamed, right? She has lost that sense of shame, which is why she's outside and she can see. And Tagore is the poet who wishes to see like her. As we know that the Shoptoponni or the Chatim tree was something that Tagore really made famous in Shantiniketan. His father had meditated under the Chatim tree. That is why he had bought that area that became Shantiniketan. And when people graduate, students graduate, they're given leaves from the tree. It's a sacred site in Shantiniketan. But there are other readings of the Chatim tree. In the Western Ghats, they call it Shaitan ki Jhad because it smells so beautiful at night that people believe that there are spirits over there, evil spirits. It's also known as Alstonia scholaris, or a tree from which they used to make slates that students could write on. Finally, it's a famous tree in Ayurveda. The bitter alkaloids of the bark is supposed to be the source of many, many medicines. And then most recently, I found out that the Chantals used this for malaria because fevers were so endemic in this part of Bengal. Some say that throughout history, we have related to trees, which have then only recently become aestheticized as icons of memory. And I'm reading against this mode of interpretation. But what happens then to the Chantals who cleared that area so that Shantiniketan could be built? And this is where I get to Tolstoy's brilliant concept of bread labor, which did not figure very prominently in Tagore's work. So Tolstoy got the idea of bread labor from this peasant philosopher, Bondaryov, who he met, and then Tolstoy actually translated his book. Bondaryov wasn't happy with Tolstoy's translations. He thought he had completely destroyed the meaning of his work. Bondaryov had written the book as an anti-exploitation tract. He said, "We are the people who grow all the food. Why do you treat us so badly?" Tolstoy reinterpreted bread labor not as of necessity, but of choice. And he interprets it through his understanding of the Gospels, in which Christ is not a divinity. Christ is a man who tells us to treat your neighbor like yourself. So for Tolstoy, bread labor was the highest expression of this brotherly love. And so he says that everyone should do bread labor because that's the only way to save ourselves from greed and affliction of acquisition, reduce inequality. And he says the first thing is you will become a more cheerful, healthier, a more alert and better man. And you will learn to know the real life from which you have hidden yourself or which has been hidden from you. And now Tolstoy derived genuine pleasure from making his shoes, plowing the land usually for widowed women, building huts, mowing the grain, even carting manure for the compost pile, raking hay. He made it look like so much fun that not only did his friends, family join, but even some distinguished aristocrats. And then he says, your conscience won't hurt as it gazes upon the toil of others. Your unhappiness is based on the avoidance of labor. If we regard physical labor as indispensable to the appeasement of our conscience and unhappiness, the result will be a non-violent community. And finally, he says, he who holds aloof from the universal moral obligation and under the pretext of a special bent to sciences or art, arranges for himself the life of a sluggard, such a man merely produces a false science and a false art. As you can see, that these are not the things people wanted to hear, so you can realize a little bit why he wasn't very popular in Russia. Now, what commentators found magnificent in his fiction, the famous mowing scene in Anna Karenina, when Levin, the idealistic landowner, works in rhythm with his peasants, seemed less impressive in real life. So when Turgenev goes to Yasnaya Polyana and he sees Tolstoy in the peasant blouse, he's like, what is he doing? Why is he so affected? And then when Tolstoy is doing his bread labor and carrying out his own chamber pot, we have generations of literary commentators, right? Nabokov, Eichenbaum, A.N. Wilson, Gary Saul Morson, Rosamund Bartlett. They are puzzled and irritated by the simple fact that Tolstoy, like Socrates, tried to live by his principles. They would have Tolstoy write, think, and lecture about principles in the time-honored and time-approved academic fashion, instead of trying to live them, however unsuccessfully. The complete break between one's daily life and art, the lack of correspondence between words and deeds, belief and action, knowledge and wisdom is celebrated, advocated, encouraged by a triumphant modernity that feeds on this radical displacement in human consciousness. So in conclusion, I'll say a few words about Tagore's Topobon, or his concept of the ashram, the forest of spiritual retreat, and I'll show you a few slides from my garden at my university. I'm going to skip the part about Tolstoy's spirituality because I'm running out of time.
I just wanted to say there is time, so please.
Okay.
There is time.
So, one of the most famous short stories of Tolstoy is Master and Man, and where this horrible rich man has taken his poor serf to buy a piece of woodland, a forest, and it's a dark winter evening, and the peasant says, we're going to die, there's a terrible storm. And of course, this man won't listen, and they go, the carriage turns over, and they're in a snowdrift, and the peasant knows he's going to die, he's resigned to his fate. And in the morning, he wakes up and he says, am I in heaven? He realizes he's alive. And why is he alive? Is because that horrible, rapacious master has covered his body with his own and saved his life. Now, Tolstoy doesn't say what made the master act this way, but it's very clear from all his writings that you only experience equality in nature, that the city is designed as a place of inequality, that you only design it in nature. Now, Tagore was haunted by the image of the Tapobon or the ashram, right? In all his writings, it comes up over and over again. And this is something very key to Indic civilizations, where much of ancient India philosophy, statecraft, literature was produced. Tagore even rereads the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, which is constructed on the pain of exile and the pleasure of the city. And he upends this trope, and instead he's talking about how beautiful the forest is, so beautiful that Rama and Sita don't want to leave the forest because the forest is so much more satisfying. And, and he writes about Shakuntala also. So he argued that exile in the forest denoted a topos of creative unity rather than the loss, heartache, and nostalgia and longing as it has been habitually represented. Now, Ananya Vajpayee, in her brilliant book, she reads Tagore through the trope of nostalgia. And I would just say that Tagore's very robust engagement with the present prevented him from wallowing in nostalgia for a vanished Indic civilization. In fact, he believed everyone should create a Tapobon in the present, a bounded space that offers comfort and inspiration to weary travelers in their journey for self-knowledge. Indeed, Tagore argued one can only claim citizenship in the world when one treads lightly on the land, creating gardens replete with flowers and fruits that nourishes the body, and sustaining cultures that link human communities with the land. Now, during the last century, Yasnaya Polyana and Shantiniketan has evolved into sites of spiritual and intellectual pilgrimage that draw hundreds of thousands of visitors from around the world. Now, why do people come and what do they seek as they wander through these worn and well-trodden places? In Russia, there are so many noble estates, far grander, far richer. The shabby and the minimalist landscaping of Yasnaya Polyana, what does it have to offer? And in India, there are so many places to go to. Are we drawn by the presence of these two literary giants, or are we seeking with them and through them alternative modes of living, being, seeing, and thinking? They tried to live their life according to their ideals, but they were mortal. And with their many flaws and eccentricities, they continued to evoke our curiosity decades later. In the end, neither men were able to walk away from fame and fortune, even though the open road beckoned them powerfully throughout their lives. Tolstoy's deep fascination with spiritual wanderers and pilgrims manifests himself in his literary works, from War and Peace to Father Sergius. And we know that he stood for hours conversing with pilgrims while they traveled the road from Moscow to the famous monastery of the caves in Kiev. Tagore himself sang Amar Mukti Aloy Aloy, which my sister has translated so beautifully. But like Tolstoy, he was unable to give away his private property. They were liminal men in liminal times, but they still continue to inspire, to evoke our curiosity. I am going to show you in conclusion my little attempt at bread labor. And as I've been arguing against the trope of nostalgia. So during COVID, we got a grant, a colleague of mine, a geologist and I, we got a grant from the Department of Agriculture. And we are trying to, we are doing research on indigenous plants that were grown prior to European colonization that were, and also climate adapted plants. Now, climate change, if we are going to experience more extreme weather, we need plants that will survive extreme heat, extreme cold, and need little water to grow. The lab has only so many varieties that they can produce, but some of these, for example, there's one seed that I have found, which is, it's a tepary bean. It grows for and I haven't found it. I got it from a biogeneticist at the University of Arizona. It has been continuously grown for 2,000 years in the United States, and it will grow above 110 degrees. And as we know, the bean is a cool weather shoulder crop. So this is one of those miracles that indigenous communities who adapted to nature have created these varieties, but they are not commercially grown. So what we are trying to do is create a seed library on our campus, and then as we are doing research on these plants, we are planting them in our garden. So let me show you the garden. So this is our database. It's crowdsourced, so my students and I are working on it. Once we are going through the Spanish language sources from the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, once we find the name of the plant, then we find the Latin name, and then we record all the uses, because what we are understanding is that we modern people eat the fruit but forget about the tree. Indigenous communities used every part of the plant, right? And those cultural uses can be tested in the lab to see how we can consume them today, right? And so what we are doing is we are putting down all the different ways these plants were used, these seeds were used, these berries were used, and we are noting the sources. If anybody wants to go in and check our work, then it is easily available. I'll show you a few pictures of this is the site that we got during COVID. A little bit of a lunar landscape with the most terrible soil. We had to truck in almost 2 truckloads of soil. Tested the soil, it was terrible, very high concentrations of lead. There's my student, Alicia Papanek, who was a partner in crime. This was the best thing that we did during COVID. We were outside 24 hours a day, digging and messing in the soil. She played a very key role. There's my husband on the right, who donated endless hours of his very busy day, because what he and Joe could dig in 15 minutes. Alicia and I spent much longer, as you can imagine. This is what the garden looks like now. This is a current student of mine, Christina Mujahedi. The garden has now become a place on campus. I give so many tours. Sometimes I feel I have to quit my regular job in the history department, because almost every day a group of students comes to me and asks me, Dr. Chatterjee, can we please go to the garden? And this is our website. Please visit it and give us our suggestions, because this is very much a crowdsourced project. We are working with lots of other organizations in the city, and we hope that 100 years hence, somebody might find this useful. Thank you so much for being so patient and being such a good audience. I will, Tapudi, you want me to go back to the first?
We can very briefly, for those who've joined later, if we could just go back to the very first slide.
Yeah.
These are beautiful photographs your daughter put together.
I know, I was so grateful to her.
Okay. So we will have Hari there, but then we can also now move to the Q&A, but I'll let Chupriya now start off.
Thank you very much. That was an absolutely wonderful, wonderful talk. And, I can do no more than to say that I think Hari would have enjoyed it very much. Hari was also, now that I think of it, he enjoyed putting into practice his passions and interests. And I remember particularly the journey that he undertook from Moscow to India, to southern India, in the footsteps of Afanasy Nikitin, the Russian traveler who came to the Deccan Plateau in I think it was the 15th century. And I remember talking about Nikitin with Hari, but Hari didn't have simply a scholarly interest in Nikitin. He also actually retraced Nikitin's footsteps. So in a sense, he reenacted that past, that travel. I found what you were saying very, very interesting in respect of the way in which you compared Tolstoy and Tagore, both anti-establishment, anti-authoritarian figures, but having a kind of presence, a kind of magnetism, which made it very difficult for the establishment to act against them. So they did not, Tagore didn't go to jail, as you say. But the censorship of Tolstoy started just about 20 years after he died, 10 years after he died. You find that they are interesting figures because they both come from landowning aristocratic families, and they profit by the global marketplace of literature, as you say, but at the same time they are distrustful of a kind of academic establishment. I found also very deeply moving, really, the passage that you quoted from Tolstoy about waking up and seeing the linden tree. And he asks, are you not ashamed? He asks himself, are you not ashamed? I think here of Tagore spending time on his family estates for the first time when he went to Shilaidaho as a young man to look after the family estates. And he writes the letters in Chinno Patravuli, where he says that he has spent the whole day drifting on the course of the stream in his houseboat and looking at the sky, the vast expanse of the sky, and at the yellow sandbank, and speaking of a rush of thoughts in his mind, where imagination, memory, all weave, he says, such a complex web of thoughts in his mind in the presence of this vast, unbounded nature, this Oshim, the idea of the unboundedness of nature, the Oshim, speaking of the boundedness and yet the unboundedness of the natural world. When you spoke of the linden tree and Tagore's use of the chatim tree, I remembered his poem Brikkhobandana, where he addresses the tree as a kind of spirit of nature, but also in very precise, very detailed terms, so that it is not an imaginary tree that he is addressing, but a real tree, a tree that is rooted in the forest, in the topobon, as you say. I was especially struck towards the close of your talk by what you said about bread labor, because this is a term that I've encountered in discussions of Gandhi. Of course, it is Gandhi who, for us, expresses an ideal of bread labor. The way in which you applied it to Tolstoy was very, very interesting to me, and it seemed absolutely justified. Obviously, Gandhi takes it from Tolstoy. His farm in South Africa was called Tolstoy Farm. And Gandhi learned a great deal from Tolstoy in this way of living with the natural world and understanding that we are part of the systems through which food is produced and life, that we draw breath, as it were. I think that perhaps Tagore did not succeed in living quite such a life so integrated into the presence and processes of nature. But it's certainly true that when he conceived the idea of Vishwabharati or of the Shanti Niketan Brahmacharya Ashram, which was the school that he started before he actually started the university, the idea of Sriniketan, which would be a place for rural reconstruction, was very much in his mind, and he was very happy when Leonard Elmhirst came and took charge of this project. He educated his own son to, give his major focus towards Sriniketan rather than the university, rather than Vishwabharati. So it seems to me that there are many parallels and many interesting ways of connecting these extraordinary figures from whom there is so much to learn, especially as in our present time of what you rightly describe as a climate of fear. I mean, so the word climate has become something that we fear. I mean, it's as though we, instead of attempting to understand or embrace the climate, as you have tried to do in your project, we fear the climate. We fear global warming, the rising sea levels, and of course there is something to be feared. But we cannot make anything of our lives or of nature unless we embrace and integrate ourselves with the world that we inhabit. I think that Tagore's response to the natural world is particularly important because he was brought up in the city. He was, in fact, a city boy, brought up in confinement in that house in Jorashako. And it was for him a release to go to Bolpur with his father and then to the Himalayas. And he went also with his father as a young boy, 14. I found it also particularly moving that you cite this passage where he speaks of this woman who comes to him and takes reverentially the dried up flowers that are just about to be thrown away. In nature, there is nothing that we waste. There's no waste in nature. And I think that both these great thinkers were very concerned with the problem of the wastefulness of modern life and the way in which we think or we divide life between, or our lives between what we throw away and what we keep. So both of these are rooted in a kind of possessive individualism, which both these writers, Tolstoy and Tagore, rejected from the bottom of their heart. And I think that, it is very much that aspect of modernity, of capitalism, that both of them found deeply unpleasant, this possessiveness and also the instrumentalization of others, the instrumentalization of whatever lies beyond the self, the putting it to use, that utilitarian spirit in which we approach the rest of the world. This, I think, is something that Tagore and Tolstoy both found deeply, deeply upsetting. And at the end of his life, when Tagore writes Shubhotar Shankot, Crisis in Civilization, it is this sense of a world that is being destroyed by our unthinking exploitation of it. So thank you very much. Thank you also for showing us what you've been trying to do with climate adapted plants. And I'm thinking also of our friends in Shantiniketan near that university campus, in Darunda, in other places in Birbhum, attempting to live to grow food without pesticides, to do various kinds of what is called now organic farming. It's just farming. Thinking of Prachi, of Aparajita, and many others. The names come to my mind now. So I think we can have questions. If people would like to put questions, please either put them in the chat box or raise your hands. Actually,
they can just unmute themselves and ask us.
Yes.
If that's easier.
Yes, they can.
And maybe, Choi, we can now stop sharing screen so that people can be now seen, their boxes can be seen better. Yeah. So I think people can either put them in the chat box or just unmute themselves and ask questions. But Choi, would you like to respond perhaps to what Shupriyadi said? And then we take more questions.
Nothing to say to Shupriyadi. I was so nervous about having Shupriyadi comment. I will share, the early training never goes away. I was so nervous that Shupriyadi will say, "Tumi kichui bojhoni, tumi ekebare bok bok korcho." So thank you, Shupriyadi, for being so kind.
Can I begin by asking you a general question and then something slightly more specific? I was very intrigued by, I am also not been able to get hold of a copy of your book as yet, but I was interested in what you're calling principles of global thought or global thinking rather. And I wanted you to maybe, using these two cases that you so beautifully brought together, Tolstoy and Rabindranath, and their thinking on a life with nature, a life bonded with nature. But I was thinking, what exactly do you mean by a larger conceptual framework of principles of global thinking? So that's really something I wanted you to talk a bit about. And the other much more specific question I had was about the question of labor, which not just bread labor, but more broadly, given the kinds of background both these intellectuals come from, highly privileged background. It seems that Tolstoy takes the question of his own physical labor, his commitment to till, his commitment to become the peasant, to an altogether different degree than perhaps Rabindranath does. I mean, he's clearly committed to this life of bonding with the thing. But I think there is also a different edge of Tolstoy walking. I mean, his physical commitment to walking, to labor, is something that also sets apart. And maybe others who know much more about Rabindranath can tell me. But it seems that Rabindranath's position remains still, even in Shantiniketan, somewhere on that pedestal. And Tolstoy seems to have, therefore, people coming to see him were saying, we want you back on that pedestal. We don't want you tilling. We don't want you leading that life. So I just wanted you to reflect on both these.
Okay. Tapu, these are excellent questions. So the principles of global thinking is the title of the chapter, and in the chapter I look at. So it is a weird juxtaposition. They're coming from extreme localism from their estates, and they're thinking about the home and the world, right? As Rabindranath said. And that one can only think about the world when you've built a home and when you've thought about your relationship to the home, the world, to self and to nature. So those are the principles I think they started with. And in the chapter, I look at three sets of ideas. One is the notion of the self. Because both of, as Shupriyadi said, this competitive individualism was something they were working against, coming from deep spiritual traditions of selflessness, as in the Christian, as well as, of course, the Hindu tradition. The second thing is they came up with a critique of imperialism, and Tolstoy much more so developed than Rabindranath, because he was part of the Russian Empire. His family built the Russian Empire, right? So he understood imperialism at a completely different level. I think Rabindranath understood it too very well, but I think Tolstoy just had that privileged perch. But they have very interesting critiques of imperialism, which is tied to their notions of individualism and capitalism. And then the last thing is that global thinking about nature can only start from the home. You cannot grasp nature in its entirety, but if you establish a relationship with nature, it gives you a critique or a sense that is different from regurgitating whatever is trendy in environmental studies. So I've called it global principles tongue-in-cheek, saying that they were starting from the most intimate, but they came up with some ideas that have stood the test of time. So that was the first thing. The second thing is Tolstoy was a giant of a man. He could cut a tree down almost into his 80s. This man had so much energy, it was unreal, right? And this physicality of his comes through, of course, in his literature. And that is why his literature is so different from all other Russian literature, because he wrote what he experienced. And bread labor for him at one point, in My Confessions, when he has a nervous breakdown at age 50, if you read it, you can see his revulsion at his living a life of the exploitation of others, because the serf culture in Russia was very much like the servant culture in India, where serfs really tended to every part of the body. And his utter revulsion and his inability to run away from it, which is why, it comes up over and over again in his literature of aristocrats running away from that milieu, but he always has to come back. He can never quite leave his wife, he can never leave his children, he can never leave his estate. So I think that his revulsion at himself was expressed in very physical terms. But his strength was quite extraordinary. Even when he dies, he's in his 80s, he's running away from home, and then he gets pneumonia at the local railway station is turned into a temporary hospital, and there are literally 100,000 people have come to participate in that death. And so even his death is bigger than life. It's the first celebrity funeral that is broadcast throughout the world, because everyone is waiting to know how is Tolstoy dying and why is Tolstoy dying. So you've hit on something, that physicality is very, very real for who the man is.
Hi, Choi and Supriya Di. Thank you so much for a really enlightening lecture. And, it really took me back in some ways to my days as a literature student at Jadavpur University, where, of course, I was taught by Supriya Di, but we didn't have Tolstoy and Tagore as a part of the curriculum necessarily. But, of course, Tagore is somebody we just end up reading. And in fact, I also connected with the bit at the beginning when you said that you were almost annoyed by the kind of obsession that there was, but then you returned to him at a later stage in life and in a very different way. One of the questions that I had was, and it's something, in fact, that I've thought of in a very different context with, the present crisis in India. But so one question was, in fact, how did Tagore and Tolstoy see the interaction between science and indigenous methods of living and farming? Because there's a way in which science both supports, but we also know of the kind of dangerous impact that it might have on those methods and ways of life. And the other question really was, in what ways were they empathetic to the lives and aspirations of a class who were peasants, who were living in villages and living close to nature? Because one of the things that we see now is this almost a change in interest, in the sense that there are people who've grown up in villages, belong to the farming class, who want to actually rise above that way of life and come to the city. And there's a different way in which an urban educated population is now interested in going back to the village for organic farming. And and literally it is an aspiration for the other. So was there any kind of reflection of these people in some ways wanting to change their ways of life as well? So yeah, if you could elaborate on that, it would be great.
Mrinalini, those are really, really smart questions, and I don't know if I can do justice to both of them, but I'll, what I'm saying is they were not anti-science, right? That if you look at Tolstoy's library, you see he's keeping up, right? I mean, they're so fascinated by these great works of science that's coming out of Europe. What he is critiquing is how is science being used? Is science being used to create more and more armaments so the Russian Empire can expand even more into Central Asia? Then he has a problem with science, right? But not with the process of scientific inquiry. I just found the other day where in the 70s, he's a beekeeper. We keep bees at home, so it is very, very hard to keep bees alive. And he's reading the recent scientific literature on beekeeping. And so he's a good landlord in that sense, where he wants to increase the stocks on his estate. Tagore, Rabindranath, as we know, was similarly, he kept up with the sciences. He read, and again, he would critique the application, not the principle of scientific inquiry. But you touch on something very important, that we do not romanticize the life of the peasant, right? And neither Tagore nor Tolstoy did that. Tolstoy, in story after story, talks about the peasant who hates being a peasant, because, and which is why when he translates Bondaryov's text through toil, Bondaryov is so angry with him because he says, you've missed the point, which is back-breaking labor is not the same as what you are doing, playing at being peasant, right? When labor is inescapable, when labor is not a choice, when labor is the only thing that you can do and never rise above that station, then what does that mean? And Tolstoy understands that at such a visceral level, that he is a nobleman who's pretending to be a peasant, but a peasant does not have any choices, right? And so his critique of society, so he is talking to Russian revolutionaries. They all come to visit him at Yasnaya Polyana. He's just worried that if we use violence to destroy the ruling class, he's saying, what is going to prevent the revolutionaries from becoming the new ruling class? So his problem is using violence as a mechanism to reorder society. Instead, he's saying there has to be, the elite has to voluntarily change their life. They have to live by a different set of values. So if the elites stop being elites, there is no aspiration. And I think what Sriniketan, what I know what Tagore was trying to do was that rural reconstruction, like Gandhi, he saw the future of India in its villages. He didn't see the future of India in the 5-year plans, the Soviet-style 5-year plans that Nehru was going to bring to India. Both of them believed that the real life of India was in the villages. So if there is an urban class in India who wants to go back to the villages, it is easy to scorn them as pretentious. It is easy to make fun of them. But I think anybody who even does that, as opposed to wasting their time in a Starbucks cafe, I would say more power to them. We all have to start somewhere.
Right. Thank you so much for those responses, Choi, Mashi. Actually, the thing is that I think even more than a certain kind of urban class going to the villages and in some ways, retuning their lives to be closer to nature, the bigger crisis over here is to ensure that people in the villages and the people who've always grown food for us end up taking pride in what they do and somewhere see new value in these spaces. I think that is the bigger crisis, because it's that lot of people who are choosing to come away. There's a real crisis in agricultural education, in fact, etc. That is the bigger crisis we often look at over here also.
Well, if we start paying a fair price, which is also a part of red labor,
yeah.
Sometimes market principles work very well. If we pay double the price, then we don't resort to chemical agriculture. Labor is actually very expensive, which is why we are using these different methods. So if we pay a fair price, there might be some market principles to address. And this is a conversation we're going to have with the Russian-Ukrainian war and the Russian grain being off the market. Every nation will have to go back to Atmanirbhar, because the global supply is gone.
Right, right. Yes. Thank you so much.
Does anybody else have any questions? Please, speak up. You can unmute yourself. Yes, sorry, Raja.
I just put up my hand. I'm taking on the organizer's privilege here to make a comment, not a question. Choi, I'm going to reach out to you because I'm fascinated by your work, and there's some overlap in the work I do with indigenous communities in Northern California. So I'll reach out to you separately about that. But in speaking about Tolstoy's death, it really brought up a memory that's very dear to our family. It's only a memory in our family. It's not something my brother, sister, or I directly experienced, but we heard this story about my father when he was 15 years old in 1941. This is the year of Tagore's death. He was a school student in Shantiniketan, in Patha Bhavan. He got to meet the great poet in person, but Tagore fell very ill, so ill, in fact, that there was a recognition that he had to be taken to a hospital in Kolkata because the medical facilities in Shantiniketan and Bolpur were not going to be enough to to tend to his medical needs. He was so sick that he couldn't sit in a car, even for that short trip from Shantiniketan to Bolpur station. They knew that once he was on the train, there would be people accompanying him, and he would be lying in the bunk in the train. But the dilemma became how to transport him from Shantiniketan to Bolpur station. So someone had this idea that there are school buses, and if we get a group of young students to unscrew the seats that the children usually sit on, then you can make room in the bus to put Tagore's bed flat in the back of that school bus. My father and one other student were very adept with their hands, so they were handed screwdrivers, and they quickly dismantled all the seats in the bus. I don't know who put them back together, but that's another story. But they were very quick at dismantling all these seats. Tagore's bed was put in there with him lying down. And as a reward for this work, my father and this friend, I don't know the name of this friend, they got to sit next to the bus driver as the bus made this trip from Shantiniketan to Bolpur station, and people lined the streets because this was the Shesh Yatra it turned out to be his last journey out of Shantiniketan. Anyway, I just wanted to share that story because it reminded me, when you talked about Tolstoy's death, it reminded me of Tagore's last journey out of Shantiniketan. Anyway, just wanted to share that.
Thank you. So wonderful story.
If I could ask, this is Kingshuk Chatterjee from Calcutta University.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Choi, lovely to see you. This is the first time I'm getting to see who you are, what you look like. We have only corresponded over email. What I'm going to say is probably slightly at a variance with the approach you have taken. So just humor me for just a brief while. I was wondering, the time when Tolstoy is writing what he is writing, and then, of course, what Tagore was writing, what he was writing about nature and how they were getting distant from the natural, the earlier way, the older way of doing things. We now know, because what you began with, this climate as a cataclysmic kind of consideration, the cataclysm had not even begun when Tolstoy was writing. Even in the agrarian space, mechanization of agriculture, Tolstoy did not even know that this was coming. And Rabindranath had probably some idea, but it really did not manifest itself in the problem that it has subsequently turned out to be. So I am a little uncertain about what was the ideal that they were thinking was being lost, because the penetration of that natural space had not really taken place. Rabindranath, at least Calcutta was this urban, cosmopolis of that time. And to that extent, Shantiniketan, I can understand the difference in terms of what the ideal was like. But it's not really the kind of mechanized industrial kind of picture we have when we're talking about, the despoliation of nature. The magnitude was completely different. Maybe the problem was also completely different, and what we are considering, what they were talking about, was not really what they were talking about. So I just wanted to find out, what was it that Tolstoy would rather have had instead of what obtained at that point of time, if I made myself clear.
No, Kingshuk, these are excellent questions. So, Rabindranath actually did see mechanized agriculture in the United States. So when he comes here, he's very impressed with the Midwest and where mechanization is beginning to start. And he's very so interested. As I said, he sent his son for education and agricultural education. So they were not opposed to mechanization. And in Russia by the 1890s, some of the larger estates in what is, the new Russia, the Northern Caucasus, Ukraine, the Donbass, where the fighting is happening now, even Trotsky's father on his smaller estate, they are bringing in mechanization. By 1899, the first decade of the 20th century, Russia is one of the biggest grain exporters to the world. So they are seeing the future of agriculture, and mechanization is seen as labor-saving technology, right? But what we don't like about mechanization now is because we live in mechanization, but those people saw them as labor-saving technology. I don't think they would be opposed to mechanization at all. I think for Tolstoy, it was a philosophical understanding of self. So bred labor, I don't think he would mind using a mechanical scythe. But I think the emphasis was on labor and the experience of equality of laboring along with people rather than the tools that were being used. But he's in Moscow, that famous period of his life, his wife insists they live there, and he takes part in the Moscow census. And he is in the city, in the terrible slums of Moscow, and he comes home. He's so upset, he can't sleep, he can't bathe, and he's seeing this kind of the poverty of the masses being thrown off the land, because land is being organized into these huge capitalist farms, and he's seeing this terrible, terrible poverty. And that is where he's thinking that, maybe the country poverty is a little better than this hideous city poverty. So Kingshuk, I know what you're saying, that it's stupid to compare what we are facing with what they were facing. They were seeing the intrusion of, we are seeing the tail end, but I don't think either of them would have a problem with mechanization per se.
If Professor Chaudhary would indulge in me for just another minute, I will intervene once more. Actually, I was not suggesting that comparing what we are facing with them is not exactly well advised. I'm just trying to, I was just trying to understand what they were looking at. And from what you said, very frankly, it's even more disturbing because if mechanization they don't have a problem with, Tolstoy was looking at a society which was, in terms of Gini concentration ratio, we are heavens of equality compared to what the imperial Russia was. And with mechanization, which was originally introduced as a kind of replacement for human labor, it was not meant to sort of bring everyone to a level of equality. So it's a kind of ideal of the landed. Even in Tolstoy's own society, say the Narodnikis would probably have laughed him out of court, that he does not even understand what the problem is. I'm being very uncharitable to Tolstoy. I'm a great admirer, right. But both Rabindranath and Tolstoy have been accused of elitism by people whose judgment I do not always agree with. But this makes it sound as if they have a point. That it was a kind of vision that was very out of step, not only with the large scale planners and movers of imperial Russia, but also the people who are being moved.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
Would that be correct reading? Okay, good, thank you.
No, Kingshuk, you're absolutely right. And for 100 years, that's what we've said, that these were out of touch elites. Tolstoy was playing at being peasant. Tagore was trying to lead the simple life, quote unquote. And that has been the tenor of the criticism, right? So I am intentionally going against the grain to say what if we tried to put some of the ideas in practice? And I think, Gandhi came to the closest, right? I think if you read the correspondence between Tolstoy and Gandhi, I think Gandhi really, he did it, he lived it, right? That's why he continues to fast. But where did Gandhi get his ideas from? So I was really trying to go back to the...
Right, yeah. And Gandhi also had that very same criticism to face. As Mahadev Desai had once said, that it takes a lot of money to keep the Mahatma in poverty.
Yeah.
And so it's
but Sabarmati Ashram, has inspired millions, right? Somebody has to start somewhere. We can't solve all the problems.
It is a corrective against the inanity of a very mechanical civilization. Absolutely correct. Yeah. But if you look at the problems, certainly not true for Russia, but for India, we were starving all the time, and it's not simply for entitlement failure, but simply because we could not produce enough that we need to consume. Russia always had a surplus. It was forcibly marketed, but it had a surplus. Or am I wrong there? You would know it better. But in India, for instance, in post-47 period, we had period when people were actually going hungry, and mass production has, while it has wiped out traditional culture, agriculture in many ways, it also has saved lives in many ways. So there are things that need to be put in balance, which we often lose sight of.
No, Kingshuk,
but otherwise enjoyed it.
No, Kingshuk, you're absolutely right. That's why I'm calling them counter-modern thinkers. They were not anti-modern, and they were not anti-science.
Right, yeah, and that distinction I understand. Good, thank you.
Yeah,
yeah, please. Finish. Yeah, I just wanted to, this is a fascinating discussion that you're having. And I wondered whether, need to bring in certain other aspects of environmentalist thinking, especially the kind of criticism that Donna Haraway and Anna Tsing level at what they call the plantationocene. That is to say, the extractive methods of modern farming. It's not mechanization per se. It's the large scale sort of extraction of of food or whatever it is, produce from the earth. And in India, if Tagore did not actually, sort of witness a highly mechanized form of agriculture, he certainly was a witness to plantation farming. That is to say, for example, the tea gardens in the northeastern parts of India were very much in place, and the tea garden strike at which Charlie Andrews and cholera broke out amongst the laborers who had the coolies, as they were called, who had refused to work, and Charlie Andrews went and tried to provide relief to the tea garden laborers. These are parts, these events are part of the history of the way in which the earth has been viewed as a source of produce and riches, as it were, of wealth, of human wealth. And this extractive, this view of agriculture as an extractive process, I think that is something where possibly, Tagore and Tolstoy's anti-modernism, in a sense, they speak to each other in some sense, because they do not view agricultural processes as necessarily or always extractive in that respect. The plantation agriculture, as it were. Mm-hmm. Anyway, that's...
Supriya, you're right, and and Kingshuk, to get back to you, Vandana Shiva, she said, we didn't need the Green Revolution, right? And we would have been just fine. And the Green Revolution was the worst thing that's happened to India. And I totally disagree with her, because at some point you have to feed people, right? You go hungry 2 days and then you realize the value of surplus. But Kingshuk, I would say that we have to balance, because the Green Revolution led to millions of lives being saved. We are also depleting our topsoil globally at a rate we cannot replace. So this is how science moves forward, right? The Green Revolution wasn't the last.
And I am in total agreement with you. we have at one point of time, we talk only of growth. At another point of time, we talk only of development. Now, for growth to be sustained, you must have development. And for development to be sustained, you must have growth. And we have not been able to balance, and therefore we look backwards into these. I am in total agreement with you there. No disputes. It's just that we frequently tend to go overboard, first in this direction, then in that direction. And that balance is the key. Absolutely. No disagreement there. Thank you for a very illuminating talk.
Thank you, Kingshu.
Okay, anyone else with questions? Tapati, what do you think? Should we wait for more questions or should we conclude? I can't see Tapati on the screen, muted. On my screen.
Tapati is muted.
Yes.
Tapati, you're muted.
Didi, you're muted.
Yes.
I said, we have dominated the conversation. Between me, I'm saying our family, and then King Shuk, who's member of the family, of course, no saying otherwise. So I'm just wondering whether there are others. As I said, I know there's Umadi who's worked on Sriniketan. There are many others who may have things to ask. So should we just invite people to unmute themselves and ask? And if there's really no more questions, then of course, that's another matter.
Umadi, I loved your book on Tagore and rural reconstruction.
Okay. Okay, so I'm presuming there are no more questions then.
If there are no more questions, though we will wait a little bit, I'd like to say that, it suddenly came to me that 5 years ago on the 15th of February, Ngugi was speaking at the Victoria Memorial in conversation with Sudhanva Deshpande. And it was a very striking occasion. Shukanta was in hospital, actually, having an operation. And I very briefly, during the sort of period when it was after visiting hours, I came over to the Victoria Memorial and there was a huge crowd of people. And you were there, Thapu and Hari. And after the talk, Hari spoke to Ngugi and about his African childhood. And I think they took photographs together. I remember this particularly because I didn't know then that it was Hari's birthday. That was the 15th of February was Hari's birthday. But I remember this occasion very, very vividly. And it was just 5 years ago, 2018.
I had posted a picture on Facebook of Hari and Ngugi because it came up as a memory. And also we had taken along a grain of wheat for him to sign, of dog-eared it, but we had taken it for him to sign. Yeah, I was also really thinking, because we look at the farmers' protest here, I recently saw one full film on it. It's really about both prosperity, but also then what happens, because, in a way, because of the Green Revolution and because of overproduction, over-extraction, what it has made is, it is almost said that unless you use fertilizers, unless you use a series of things now, it has made what we consider a different kind of agriculture almost impossible, which is in a way at the heart of what was happening really, was to say that we need to really claim back a whole different, and this idea of value that Mrinalini raised, here are a group of people who placed huge value on their identity as farmers. My brother Poranjoy has been a part of the farmers' protest in a big way. So, I mean, he may be able to share, but I recently saw a very moving film made by a Canadian who then came and looked at women, engaged with them over that time, and began to talk about what is at stake, really. You know, the fact that they really sat there for 100 days, right? I mean, it's something unprecedented in the history of modern India, that kind of a farmers' protest. And we've had other kinds of Khatro Andolon, you know, all of that. So that again puts it into perspective on what was at stake. I mean, it's really Punjab which is at the heart of it, but also to what it means then to have a larger corporatization of agriculture. What does it mean? That's just a reflection.
Absolutely. Yes, that's exactly, you know, what I meant by this extractive agriculture. Thank you.
So if there are no more questions, then we will end this evening today.
I'd like to thank everyone for being here and for participating, for listening, for being with us today. I have, you know, been sort of privileged to be here, but that's not what we, you know, we speak of. It has been a very moving occasion for all of us who have been present today, and I'm glad I was here. We miss Hari, and we remember him, and we hope that he is listening to us.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Shupriyadi. And I just wanted to end by saying that what is, you know, in some ways an online lecture, one misses that gathering, the physical gathering, which I'm glad we were able to do for Hari this year. A few days ago, get a young kind of really creative artist to come and talk about Soviet children's literature. But the good thing about the online program is that Hari, because Hari grew up in various parts of the world, ranging from Africa to UK and back in India, there are people, his friends from across, who can attend. And I just end this evening by thanking everybody who stayed on right till the end, who joined us, family, friends, colleagues, to say we hope we can keep going in the coming years, this tradition of a gathering on Hari's birthday, a memorial lecture, with which, apart from, we learn a lot from each of these lectures. So thank you immensely, Choi, for this wonderful talk and for bringing in your own practice, which has always been something that has inspired me, but I've learned about it only long distance. That I hope we can keep this tradition going in the coming years of this gathering and a memorial lecture around the time of Hari's birthday. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And thank you, Raja, for being the host and recording it.
On that note, I'll stop the recording.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tapudi, Shupriyadi, Raja.
Thank you. And I hope to meet you in person whenever you're coming next. And I hope that will be sooner rather than later.
I'll be there in December. And King Shuk, good to catch up with you virtually. So
well, we are yet to actually catch up. So the next time you come, let's make a point of meeting.
Okay. I look forward.